So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Dr. Rob Walker, who is Vice President, Decision Management and Analytics at Pegasystems. I had a chance to sit down with Rob when I met up with him at PegaWorld in June. Now, over to the conversation. Welcome.
Thank you.
Would you like to introduce yourself for the benefit of our listeners and kind of readers?
Absolutely. Rob Walker, the Vice President of Decisioning and Analytics, and that includes AI as well for Pegasystems.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So, first of all, I want to congratulate you on your keynote that you did at PegaWorld, because I thought it tackled some really big issues. Emotion, AI, impact, ethics, and we'll come back to some of those sort of things. But one of the things that I've been looking at over the last kind of few months, and something I wrote about sort of last year, was this idea that there's a lot of companies that are investing heavily in technology to try and improve their service and experience. But it's almost a bit like they're sort of overshot the investment or overinvested, and it's like research shows that customers start going, I just want you to make it easy for me to talk to somebody when I need to talk to them, when they have a problem. And so it seems to be at the heart of it, because there's this balance between getting the human touch in tech and customer experience. And I'd be interested to get your perspective on what you see companies doing to strike that balance and maintain that kind of balance and getting the balance, because it's going to be an ongoing thing, right? Mm-hmm. And it'll be different for different kind of customer segments. So it'd be interesting to just get your sort of take on that.
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things, because I agree that it all gets very technical and maybe a little clinical in some areas. On the other hand, I do think that the technology that we now see emerging, notably around AI, is actually making it, and I know it's not human, but it's very human-like, right? Yeah. It's talking to the series of this world. I mean, it's not the same, but it's definitely not like looking in a menu.
No.
So I think and I think for a lot of people that may just be enough.
Yes.
Right. So that's I think that's one thing. And the other thing is what I see is happening, that a lot of channels now become, smart enough. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, in the chatbot. The chatbot that we do, to be intelligent enough and smart enough to say, okay, well, this actually should really be handled by a human, and then do a seamless handover, right? And I think that is also something that that we see a lot of, right? So that's really also like this collaboration of technology and humanity. I mean, these are very big words, but
sure.
but in practice, it means that it's not either or, right?
Yes.
The human in sort of assisted channels already gets a lot of input, right?
Yes.
From AI and analytics to say, well, this is what you should be talking about. So the voice may be human, and the demeanor, but in reality, what is being said, it's all decided by technology that sees a lot more data than that human would.
And do you think there's possibly a risk that there's some people are being, I know we talked about a little bit about this before, in terms of that sort of the technology is driving almost decision making too much, and there's not enough sort of stepping back and designing what the outcomes that people want to achieve, and then picking the right set of technology for them? Because I know there was data that shows that the average company now they're serving their customers through about 9 different channels, and that's set to grow to about 11 over the course of the next 18 months.
Yeah.
But what the same piece of research shows that the majority of those companies don't have any of those channels connected. Yeah. And when they add new channels, they're tending to add another bit of technology and another team, and therefore another silo. Yes, and it's almost exacerbating the kind of problem. And you're thinking, why don't you just stop a second?
Yes, no, that is absolutely a process that's been going on, because there's always this new sexy channel. Now we need to get Messenger, and then there's no budget to do it well, so therefore tactically we just add that as a channel, and it's completely disconnected. Now, obviously, in our case with with the Pega Customer Decision Hub, the whole idea is that that's how you connect all the channels, right? And I have to say that the majority of companies I talk to, but that's obviously a very biased sample, because they are all buying into this centralized intelligence. You have this one brain that is orchestrating that, and all the channels are connecting to that, and then it's completely seamless. But I personally, talk to a lot of companies, and I always have to make that point that even if the channel, even it's a really well developed, channel implementation that's very pleasant and all, if it's not connected, it will still break the customer experience, and also the agility. Then if you change something, you say, oh, actually I would like to talk a little bit more about this, or we want to make this a little bit cheaper, or whatever it is. Now you have to program that into all the different channels, because you have all this frozen logic sitting in these channels. It's just horrible.
But also regardless of how good you might be in a channel, the problems always happen when you're passing the baton over between sort of two channels. It's almost like the interface between things.
Yes.
And so if you don't have a proper view of that, if you don't have a holistic kind of view, then you can't really see the whole sort of picture.
No, that's true. But what I would add to that is that, and this is I think a major trend that is going on, but again I see a biased sample, is that so many companies, especially if they have a lot of channels, so it's clear to them that this is becoming an issue. They do put this this customer decision hub in the middle of it, and that means that all the intelligence is out of the channel. So now the channel is only presentation. And that makes it way easier to control, and then it is also it's always a seamless handover, right? So these problems really go away.
Because what you're talking about is you're talking about this customer decision hub. You're effectively saying this is a single unified view of the customer that people have been talking about for the last sort of 20 odd years, and you're saying we can do that. It's here. That's how we can do it.
Yeah, but so that's the unified view of the customer is sort of a data view.
Yeah, but then there's a plus.
This is the action view. Yeah. So now the actions are the intelligence of what to do with the customer is also centralized.
So let's talk about the customer, and this idea around customer sort of engagement, because it's that's sort of what we're really talking about, because everything else is just technology and people and process and stuff, right? And the thing that really matters is getting a customer to engage with you and do something which is meaningful kind of with you. Hopefully spend some money, and then hopefully keep spending money, and hopefully advocate for on your behalf as well. But it's a big challenge for organizations to engage their customers, or engagement seems to be this perennial kind of challenge. I mean, can you tell me kind of what you think the real challenge is for organizations when it comes to engagement, and then project forward what do you think that it's going to look like in the future? What it could and what could it be?
Well, I think engagement is sort of the whole currency of a customer relationship, right? So, and a lot of companies that I talk to actually are looking more at volume of engagement and sometimes quality of engagement. But again, if that's true, I think a lot of companies are doing that in a very suboptimal way. For instance, even by separating their inbound channels from their outbound channels, that's already missing such an opportunity for a much more normal, proactive, outreach, right? In our vision, this is like we call this always on, right? There is a customer strategy that the company has agreed on. It runs in this customer decision hub, and in inbound it will just do its thing and decide on the next best action and present that in the channel. But if the customer actually doesn't get in, so the customer doesn't get in touch, then at some point the priority will become high enough, or there is an event that happens that will prompt the customer decision hub to reach out. Right. And say, oh, did you know about this? Or I see you're struggling with this, or we believe this is relevant to you, right? But it's an always-on thing. It's not like, oh, let's wait for September to do our, our platinum campaign or whatever it is, right? This is an always-on thing. Whenever somebody,
whenever it's appropriate in inbound, or if it's appropriate enough to reach out outbound, that's what this does, and that I think is a much more natural sort of engagement model than we've seen before. But you have to design that as a sort of a framework. Is that where the difference lies for each company that they take on this customer decision hub? Is that they then design, if you like, the principles around the relationship that they want to have with their customers?
Yes.
And the engine, the brain is the execution.
Yes, it's the execution, and it will support it with a lot of AI and technology. So for instance, the whole yes, and all the relevance. So it will tell people, well, this is very relevant, or this is very risky. But how do you want to deal with it? What is the rule? When do you want to sell? Do people have to be very interested if you want to sell them something, or can it be moderately interested? But the level of interest, that's all done by AI, right? Continuously.
Yeah.
So that's
But I think what's interesting thing is that actually what it's actually doing is forcing a company or an organization or a brand or whoever to actually think about, to sit down and think about what is the sort of relationship that we want to have with our customers, and how would we like to develop it in probably very kind of real and very kind of human kind of terms. And I've not seen many firms kind of do that, which is interesting, because it's it means that they take a much more mature approach to that relationship, rather than being share of wallet, as it were, which is completely transactional and disposable as well.
Completely transactional. It's also very siloed, because in such a model, a lot of people own a piece of the customer. But you're exactly right, and I love that process always, right? And the customers you heard here, right? Sprint, Transavia, Scotia Bank. Yeah. All of those, and many others that are here, all go through that process. But it is exactly what you say, and I really like that, is that it forces companies to actually put the customer first, and then think, what do we actually want to do? Under what conditions are we going to sell instead of retain or service? And if we are going to sell, under what conditions are we going to sell cards? Because now, this was a bank, right? I was just making this up. But because normally the cards people and the mortgage people and the savings people will make things up and do their own. It's actually an insane process. Yeah. And now this is like a mind map of the priorities of the brand, and then you execute it. And in terms of the analytics that are concerned, there is AI to support that, but the humans set they're all their policy rules. They decide on the margins.
So then going back to your keynote, there was a part of it where you talked about a report that you did, and about people's concerns around kind of AI, and it was primarily driven by sort of fear of what could happen and things. That resonated with me, because it's I personally think that the conversation, or the general narrative around AI is it's not helpful, because it's too general. It's like it's up here in the cloud, pardon the pun, but it's because it's not really tied in sort of reality and what we want to actually use some of these tools sort of for. But there's some real risks with that, and you touched on that around deep learning and whether it's kind of machines are learning, and whether we understand how the outcomes that they're coming to. I mean, can you explain to me how you're kind of addressing some of those kind of risks? Because you talked about opaque and transparent sort of mechanisms, and but it'd be interesting just to capture your perspective on some of the things you talked about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so first of all, what I try to make sure is that there is no moral judgment, or that we would say as Pega, for instance, you cannot use opaque AI. No. But opaque AI, that's AI that can intrinsically not explain itself. Sure. And that doesn't mean it can't be effective, but it is high risk, because you don't know how it works or what kind of attitudes it may have developed, and certainly in edge cases, and therefore you have to test for that. Right? In transparent AI, that's not the case, because you can just see what they do. So if they do weird things, that's explicitly in the model. It may still be hard to discover, because they can be still complex. Yeah. But
it's auditable, I guess.
It is auditable, right. Exactly. So that's why, for instance, in as I mentioned, like in risk management or those areas, you would always insist on transparent models. But in other areas, opaque is fine. And also, let's not forget, humans are completely opaque, right? So people tend to forget that it's not like we. So obviously, we can argue why we did certain things, but we're just making that up. That's not how it actually works, right? So humans are exactly like an opaque AI algorithm, and that has pros and cons.
But is there if people think about opaque and transparent AI, does that mean that the opaque AI could be inherently more powerful in its analytical ability because it's opaque and it's doing its own thing, or can transparent AI be equally kind of powerful, or is it just you're just separating it out in terms of auditability or understandability?
Just from with my computer scientist hat on, the fact that it has to be able to explain itself is a restraint.
Right.
So there's fewer degrees of freedom for it to evolve. So so
you're dialing down the horsepower
a little,
but you're going to be able to drive the car a little bit more safely.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Yes. But by virtue of making it understandable by humans.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes it harder.
It gives us a semblance of control of some sorts. But also within that conversation, so because I know you've kind of talked about the features that you can give people the opportunity to switch between the degrees of how understandable or not it is, and that's great from a risk and regulation and compliance kind of perspective. But within all of that sort of stuff, you sort of raised this prospect of this ethical sign-off, particularly if you're using the more opaque sort of version.
Yes.
And that was interesting because something that I've written about recently was because I started to question, whether it's AI and data and privacy and security and the impact of behavioral science and behavioral designs, whether you're nudging something or you're designing something to get somebody hooked on it. And I was thinking, how compatible is that with being customer centric? All of these different sort of things. And so raise that prospect of around there's this rising ethical dimension to sort of how we make decisions in customer experience. And to see you raise that, and I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. So, but if there's sign-off that implies that there's a whole governance sort of structure that goes with that. I mean, so what do you think is going to be required to back up that sort of that sign-off? Is that something that needs setting up in terms of guidelines, or how far does it go, or is that still early?
No, I don't think that's early. I think in some of the cases, right? You mean later you may get into the to the morality of making automated decisions in the first place, right?
Yes.
So that's so I'll stay out of that one.
That's a Greek academy sort of discussion.
Exactly.
Or my toga's in the laundry getting washed.
But the fact that that especially these opaque AIs, because you cannot control them through the data, right? So they can take limited data, but then infer all sorts of things. Actually, a long time ago, I actually did sort of a science project for an insurance company, and they said we want to be politically completely correct, and we want to make sure that, and this was in car insurance, that we don't distinguish between gender. So we're not going to get gender in the data. So we are sure that whatever the policies are, it's not like we're favoring women or men or whatever it is. So they don't. That's how they wanted to advertise, how they wanted to be known.
Yeah.
So I showed, or my team showed, that we could infer gender from the rest of the data with 100% accuracy. So there was not even a touch of doubt, right? Not a dash of it. So, and that means that if you take that understanding, that you cannot control it like that. So your AI can create all of these attitudes or biases that you have to test for. So what this ethical sign-off is, it should be part of the corporate policy, but it is not different from what they should be doing if they had human people or human people. That most of the case that's the case. But if they had humans doing the prioritization or the selection of people, it's the same thing. The only thing is you cannot just see, this model is looking at people over 55 and they have to live in the southeast, and so that's explicit.
Yes.
And then you can say, that's not what I want. I don't want to target people over 55. But in these opaque AIs, you have no idea.
Right.
So you have to basically look at their output and test it on a bias, on a test specifically set up. Yeah. And that should then output a report where you say, this is my age distribution, this is maybe my race distribution, whatever you're sensitive about, and if you have the data to actually get to these reports. And then somebody needs to say, that's acceptable or not.
Yeah. So I guess what you're basically saying is if there's this ethical sign-off, it's there will be existing guidelines and policies that support decision making in most organizations, and you're saying, actually this is new and fast evolving decision enabling technology, and we need to kind of understand what it's doing, and then it needs to be added into the existing kind of policies and guidelines.
Yes,
as
I
part
think
of the thinking, as it were.
Because I think the policies are for decent companies are in place.
Yeah.
My warning was that if they use opaque AI, they don't know if that adheres to these policies unless you explicitly simulate
Which
it.
is why what you're saying is like you're making it explicit. Is you need to put this, or need to understand this is what possibly could happen, and therefore we need to be explicit in our understanding of like, is this aligned with our culture, our brand values, our corporate values, and so on and so forth. But I think it's an important point because things are moving at such a pace that almost it's. We've seen all sorts of different kind of cases of things kind of producing, what can we call it, suboptimal outcomes.
Yeah. Yes.
And therefore people need to pay attention to it, because I think that for me the bottom line of all of this is whilst it's interesting and it's exciting and the possibilities are endless, they are powerful tools.
Yeah.
And I think in my the article that I wrote, there's an old saying which I think it comes from Spider-Man, but it's also attributed to somebody else. Which says, "With great power comes great responsibility."
Yes. But I will also say, and I didn't say this in the keynote, but I think people, because I didn't want to make it even more, pivoting and tangential. But the issue is, of course, that if these AIs get more and more powerful, then there's also the issue, like for instance, if there is a medical diagnosis, you do not understand how it got to that diagnosis, but it's more likely to be correct than some physician. What do you do? Right? At some point, people are just going to trust the magic or the gods.
Yeah.
Right? And anyway, so that's a little far off, but in principle, even if you bring it down to something very, very, very tangible, like credit risk, right? People do these scores, and the regulator insists on transparent models, so they understand exactly how a bank is judging these risks. That's fine, but an opaque AI might actually be more effective, and that means that you're not giving loans to people who are not going to repay, and also getting themselves into trouble. So basically, you're accepting more errors.
Yeah, you're getting into Minority Report type of territory, right? It's
a little
that sort of stuff. Yeah. But that's an even bigger conversation about not just about ethics and morality, but it's about just general philosophy and kind of position and relationships. And
but are you in sort of, if we keep it sort of to a sort of a customer engagement thing, are you accepting more mistakes, errors in that errors that will benefit the company and errors that will benefit the customer, because you insist on transparency, because that is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
You're consciously getting stupider.
Well, shall we leave it there? I think that's probably not a bad note to end on. Rob, as ever, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.